The grand forum of the Stellar Alliance echoed with the voices of 100 species, their tones a mix of commands, arguments, and indifference. It was a place where empires negotiated peace and war, where monarchs and diplomats shaped the fate of the galaxy. And yet, Princess Lyra of the Scylla went unseen. She stood just under a meter tall, her slender figure barely noticeable amidst the towering forms of delegates twice or thrice her size. The Scylla were a race known for their agility and intellect, but their stature, so small compared to galactic norm, had long consigned them to irrelevance. Lyra felt every bit of it. The princess wore royal robes of silver and indigo, fabrics woven from her home world's finest threads. A delicate crown of iridescent crystals sat atop her head, shimmering in the forum's artificial light. She walked with her head held high, but her violet eyes couldn't hide her pain. "I see the princess has arrived," a low voice muttered from nearby. Lyra's chest tightened. Her people were mocked across the Alliance. The Scylla, once innovators, had been forgotten as the galaxy's giants claimed dominance. Her diminutive size made it worse. Every alien male dismissed her as a child, a curiosity at best unworthy. She swallowed her pride, pretending not to hear as the Orion general, a 6-foot-tall brute with skin like molten stone, sauntered past her. He sneered, "A princess no one wants." What a tragedy. Her hands clenched under her flowing sleeves, nails biting into her palms. She couldn't afford to lose composure here. This was her father's final hope for Scylla recognition, her mission. But every snide remark, every stare that passed through her like she was air, chipped away at her will. The galaxy had no place for someone like her, or so they believed. At the far end of the forum hall, a man in a Dark Earth coalition uniform leaned against a marble column. His posture was casual but observant, his steel blue eyes scanning the delegates with a soldier's vigilance. This was Captain Marcus Hale, a seasoned human officer assigned to the Alliance's diplomatic security detail. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short brown hair and a scar running across his jaw, Marcus looked as out of place as Lyra felt. Only in his case, it seemed intentional. As his gaze swept over the hall, he noticed her. The small princess stood out, not for her size but for the dignity with which she carried herself. Unlike the loud, imposing delegates, she moved quietly, deliberately, alone, a star in the vast black void of space. "Who's she?" Marcus asked. A nearby officer chuckled. "That's Princess Lyra of the Scylla, Galaxy's most irrelevant royal. Poor thing's been rejected by every diplomat and alien prince from here to the edge of the void." Marcus arched a brow. "Rejected?" "Yep. Their males are small too, but she's different. No one takes her seriously. Honestly, I'm surprised she bothers showing up." Marcus didn't like the tone. He glanced back at the princess and caught something fleeting in her expression. An exhaustion, she had well, a vulnerability under all that stoic composure. He'd seen it before, the look of someone fighting not a break, and he respected that. Lyra stepped onto a small balcony, away from the sneering crowd. She needed air, a moment to breathe. The massive spires of the Forum City rose around her, their golden hues glowing under 3 setting suns. She gripped the railing, letting the silence wash over her. "I'm wasting my time," she whispered to no one. "They'll never listen." "Giving up already?" The voice startled her. She spun around, startled to find Marcus standing a few feet away. He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Didn't mean to scare you." Her gaze narrowed. "Who are you?" "Captain Marcus Hale, Human Coalition," he said, stepping closer. "I was just making sure you weren't about to jump off the balcony." Lyra blinked. "What? I?" "Good to hear," Marcus grinned, unfazed. Silence lingered between them. Lyra's small frame was almost comical next to Marcus's towering form, but he didn't look at her with pity or condescension. He simply looked at her like she was someone worth seeing. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Just observing," he said with a shrug. "Though I admit I was curious. Everyone in there seems to either ignore you or insult you. Can't figure out why. Because I'm small. Because I'm Scylla." Her voice was flat. "My people aren't important." Marcus crossed his arms. "Important to who?" "To the galaxy," Lyra replied bitterly. Well, the galaxy sounds like an idiot, Marcus said bluntly. She blinked. Excuse me? I mean it. You're here, aren't you? Carrying yourself like you belong, even when they act like you don't. I'd say it takes more guts than any of those blustering giants in there. For the first time in days, Lyra felt her shoulders relax, if only a little. Marcus's words weren't flowery or political. They were just honest. And honesty was something she'd been starved for. You're a strange human, Captain Hale, she said quietly. Marcus, he corrected, smiling. And you're not nearly as insignificant as they think you are, Princess Lyra. A faint flush rose to her cheeks. She turned back toward the city, hiding a small, grateful smile. Marcus stayed by her side, staring out at the sprawling skyline. For him, this was just another day at work. But for Lyra, it was the first time someone had seen her, not as a joke, not as a failure, but as a person. And in the quiet of that balcony, something sparked between them, a small connection in a galaxy that had always felt too big. Lyra didn't know it yet, but this human soldier would change her fate, and perhaps her fate would change his too. For the first time in years, Princess Lyra didn't feel invisible. Captain Marcus Hale had said so little, yet his words stayed with her like a warmth she hadn't realized she was missing. She had no illusions. Marcus was a stranger, a soldier from a distant world, here out of obligation. But he saw her. That, in itself, was rare enough to be precious. The silence stretched between them as they stood on the balcony, looking over the glowing expanse of the Forum City. Marcus finally broke it, his tone casual. So, what brings a princess to the circus? Lyra tilted her head, her voice tinged with sarcasm. I thought you were just observing. I am, but observation tend to raise questions, he said, turning and leaning against the railing. Call a human curiosity. Lyra sighed softly. My father sent me to make an appeal for skill recognition. He believes the Stellar Alliance is our last chance to rebuild our place in the galaxy. Marcus frowned. Rebuild? Our people weren't always this diminished, Lyra explained. We were once architects of progress, innovators of technology. The galaxy admired us. But when larger species rose to power, we were dismissed, seen as weak and expendable. Over time, our name faded into obscurity. Marcus's gaze hardened, a spark of something indignant flashing in his eyes. They turned their backs on you because you weren't big enough for their standards? Lyra shrugged, tried to appear indifferent, though bitterness clung to her voice. The galaxy values power above all else. My father believes I can prove we're more than our size, that we still have worth. And do you? Marcus asked, his tone direct but gentle. Lyra turned sharply, glaring at him as if he'd insulted her. Of course I do. Marcus raised his hands in surrender, an amused smile playing at the corner of his lips. Good. I figured as much. Lyra blinked, caught off guard by his response. You're very strange for a human. Marcus chuckled. I get that a lot. He shifted slightly, his expression growing more serious. But here's the thing, Princess. Believing in your worth is only the start. If you're going to convince a room full of self-important aliens, you'll need to prove it. Show them something they can't ignore. Lyra frowned. And how do you suggest I do that? They don't listen to me. You make them listen, Marcus said simply. You're small, sure, but that's not a weakness. It's a weapon. You're quick, smart, and most importantly, underestimated. Use it. Lyra stared at him, her violet eyes wide. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Not with such confidence, not with a belief that she could do something. For a moment, she felt as though a door had been cracked open. You talk as though I'm preparing for war, she said quietly. Marcus's expression didn't waver. Diplomacy is its own kind of battlefield, Princess. And in my experience, the smallest fighters often win the biggest fights. Before she could respond, a sudden loud chime echoed through the air, a signal that the forum would soon resume. Marcus straightened. Duty calls, he said, a little regretful. But hey, give them hell in there, Princess. Lyra watched as he turned and strode back into the corridors of the great hall. For a long moment, she stayed where she was, Marcus's words replaying in her mind. Make them listen. Show them something they can't ignore. Her father's voice always echoed in her head. Be quiet. Be respectful. Wait for them to see reason. But what if waiting wasn't enough? What if Marcus was right? The next session of the forum was already underway when Lyra entered. The council chamber was alive with the voices of towering diplomats and generals debating the merits of a proposed trade alliance between the larger empires. Lyra, as always, had been given a small seat near the edge of the room, far from the central platform. But this time, she didn't sit down. Instead, she stepped forward, her small form approaching the grand speaker podium. The murmur started immediately. Some were curious, others were amused. The Arachon general was among the first to sneer. The Skilla wishes to speak? What can a species so small have to say? Lyra ignored him. She climbed the steps to the podium, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. She gripped its edge to steady herself, her voice soft but clear when she spoke. The Skilla do not ask for pity. We do not ask for favors. We ask for recognition, for the right to stand as equals in this galaxy. Her words rang out, surprisingly strong for someone so small. For a brief second, silence fell over the chamber. But it didn't last. You waste our time. A delegate from the Zeni Collective barked. The galaxy has no need for insects. Laughter rippled through the room, sharp and humiliating. Lyra's vision blurred, but then she heard the princess. A deep voice boomed. Lyra turned in shock to see Marcus standing at the edge of the hall, his coalition uniform gleaming under the lights. He crossed his arms, his voice carrying easily. Seems to me she's braver than half of you combined. Maybe you should hear her out before dismissing her. The room quieted. Lyra stared at him, words catching in her throat. Marcus gave her a small, encouraging nod, and suddenly she found her voice again. You laugh at my people's size, Lyra continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. But it is not size that wins wars, that builds civilizations. It is ingenuity, resilience, unity. My people may be small, but our strength lies in what we create, in how we endure. Her voice grew louder, her conviction undeniable. If the Stellar Alliance values only strength of muscle and size, then it is doomed to fall, because true strength lies in how you rise, even when the galaxy pushes you down. The silence that followed was heavier this time. Marcus smiled from his place near the door, his chest swelling with pride. Lyra stepped back from the podium, her hands trembling. She didn't know if her words had changed anything yet, but for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. And across the chamber, as the towering delegates murmured among themselves, some began to look at the small princess with new eyes. For Marcus, one thing was clear. The galaxy had been wrong about her, and they wouldn't ignore her for much longer.